Why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Mayer. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor at the Marshall Project. We are a nonprofit investigative news organization covering the criminal justice system in America. And I'm very excited to be able to moderate this conversation with these five gentlemen here, talking about uniform crime reporting data that's come out this year and about measuring crime in general. I'm going to start right off by introducing our panelists, though I'm sure most of you know all of them already. First, I have Thomas Abt. He's a senior research fellow with Harvard Center for International Development, where he leads the center's Security and Development Seminar Series. Both in the United States and globally, he teaches, studies, and writes on the use of evidence-informed approaches to reducing gun, gang, and youth violence, among other topics. Let's see, to his left, we have Adam Gelb. He was a reporter in Atlanta for several years in the 1980s and 90s, covering police and the drug war. And since then has worked twice in Congress and for governor's offices in Maryland and Georgia. For the past 11 years, Adam has run Pew's Public Safety Performance Project, which has now worked with more than 35 states to help them safely reduce their prison populations. To Adam's left, we have Ames Grauert. He's counsel in the Brennan Center's Justice Program and the John L. New Justice Council. A former prosecutor, his work seeks to develop an understanding of the cost of America's criminal justice system to defendants, inmates, and the nation as a whole, and to translate that information into legal change. To Ames's left, we have Jim Parsons. He's the Vice President and Research Director at the Vera Institute of Justice, where he's responsible for shaping Vera's research agenda. His work focuses on public health, drug policy, international development, and various aspects of the criminal justice system, including research on sentencing policies, courts, and corrections. And then finally, on the end here, we have David Kennedy. He's a professor of criminal justice at John Jay College of Criminal Justice here in New York, the host for this event. And he's the director of the National Network for Safe Communities. David and the National Network support cities implementing strategic interventions to reduce violence, minimize arrest and incarceration, enhance police legitimacy, and strengthen relationships between law enforcement and communities. So I thought we'd start first by giving each of our panelists a few minutes to talk about the latest UCR numbers, and then we'll start throwing some questions at them. Thomas, you want to go first?
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to talk with you about this subject. Since we're sort of doing sort of a lightning round up front, I'm just going to give you sort of my sort of top line thoughts, and I'll reserve sort of more detailed comments for later. Just to sort of start us off, in 2016, the last year for which we have the official UCR data, there were 17,250 homicides. That's up 8.6% from 2015, and that comes on the heels of a 12.1% increase in 2014-2015. That adds up to about a 21 or 22% increase in homicide over 2 years, which is the largest two-year increase in 25 years. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the rates of violent crime here in the United States right now are about half of what they were at their peak in the early 90s. With regard to violent crime, there were about 1.2 million violent crimes in 2016. That was up 4% from the previous year, up 4% from the previous year from that, so for a total two-year increase of about 8%. Again, not just the rates of homicide, but the rates of violent crime are about half of what they were from their high in 1991 or 1992. The big question that we're here to discuss is this a trend? I think the only serious answer is we don't know yet, we can't be certain. Murder began to rise precipitously in the early 1960s. It ultimately peaked in the early 90s, and then it dropped more or less steadily for 2.5 decades. There was a 2-year rise 10 years ago in 2005 and 2006, and then murders continued to drop. So we've been here before in terms of a 2-year rise. One thing to keep in mind is that this surge is much larger than the previous one. We have a 22% surge 2016 through 2014. The previous one was about 5%, but the rate of increase is slowing. And I think that so the rate of increase in 2015 was very high. The rate of increase in 2016 is lower. I think we can expect, based on some preliminary data, that if there is an increase in 2017, it will be lower still. But I want to conclude my initial outset, which is that in some ways this question of is this a trend is somewhat besides the point, because in some ways it doesn't matter. The rates were already far too high, much higher than in other developed nations, and especially too high for poor communities of color. And so one thing I just want to get across is that this issue of violent crime, of homicide, is an important issue, literally a matter of life or death, whether or not there is a trend going on. And too often, this issue is considered sort of a political football that's carried back and forth. Criminal justice reformers sometimes want to downplay the issue because they worry that this is going to impact the momentum for other criminal justice reforms. Other people want to exaggerate the issue and sow fear and division and link this to other issues like a broader cultural war, or a tough on crime, or law and order agenda about crime and immigration. But I think for the purposes of this conference and this panel in particular, I want to speak to the reformers, and I just want to note that I think it's very important that there is a progressive criminal justice response to the issue of violent crime. It disproportionately impacts the constituencies that we reformers claim we care about, which is poor communities of color. The violence in these communities causes intense suffering, and if we fail to address that suffering, it's a real disservice to them. And ironically, many of the best anti-violence strategies are actually pushed and developed by criminal justice reformers. We have one of them at the opposite end of this panel. So I would argue that the work has been done, the foundation is laid, and progressive reformers simply need to elevate this and make it part of their overall response. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think too often the framing is that criminal justice reform and public safety or violence reduction are framed to be in contradiction or in tension with one another, when in fact I think over the long run promoting legitimacy and reform is actually a very smart crime reduction strategy. And if we can improve the legitimacy of the system, we are seeing more and more research that retires legitimacy or illegitimacy of the criminal justice system to violence. So what I want to sort of leave you with this very brief introduction is that with crime reduction and justice reform, it's not either or, it's both and. Thank you.
Grab that from you? Sure. I would like to associate myself with those remarks, Thomas. Thank you. Wonderful. Put yourself back 10, 12 years. 2005, 2006, we had 2 consecutive years of increases in violent crime. And at the time, there were dire warnings that we were headed back to the peaks of the early 90s. That did not come to pass, which is terrific. And I'm not going to try to prognosticate here, but there are a number of reasons to think that we might be seeing a leveling off, maybe even a decrease. Ames, you will, I'm sure, be talking about that so far this year. But in 2007, so exactly 10 years ago, after these 2 consecutive increases, the Attorney General at the time, Alberto Gonzales, issued a statement that I think captures pretty darn well exactly where we are today after 2 years of consecutive increases. I want to read it to you so I get it right. In a speech, he said, "In general, it doesn't appear that the current data reveal nationwide trends. Rather, they show local increases in certain communities. Each community is facing different circumstances, and in many places, violent crime continues to decrease." Does that sound right for about what we're looking at today? So it's fascinating to see the difference. There's a great example of where you stand depends on where you sit. and the reaction of the current administration and others to what we're seeing now. So at Pew, we kind of looked at these, looked at what's going on and boil it down to three overarching points: context, concentration, and fluctuation. I'm just going to cover those real quickly. By context, we mean historical context. Thomas hit that a little bit. We're still, despite these increases, still at about half the levels we were in the peaks of crime in the early 1990s. If you look at violent and property crime together, you actually are still headed down, not up. And there's so many different ways to put this, but since 1971, you can go all the way back then, there have only been 5 years with a lower violent crime rate than there was in 2016. On concentration, it's terrible that so many fingers point at Chicago, Nina. But it is illustrative of just how concentrated, particularly the murder increase has been. Moving from 2015 to 2016, 22% of the murder increase is accounted for by the increase in Chicago, and 15 cities account for 51% of the increase in homicide in particular. If you look back a little bit the way Thomas just did, you notice that's still heavy, I would say heavy concentration, but it's not quite as heavy as it was from 2014 to 2015. So we are seeing a little bit less concentration, though it's still characterized as fairly heavy concentration in certain cities and jurisdictions, and particularly certain neighborhoods within those cities. And then finally, fluctuation. When you look at those big overall aggregate numbers, particularly the property crime trend, you see a steady decline in property crime since the peak in 1991. Violent crime did have that peak in 1991, dropped, increased in 05 and 06, and then started declining again. Murder, however, has been bouncing around a little bit over time. Again, there are a number of ways to illustrate this, but we just looked over the past 10 years, and the wonderful interactive that the Marshall Project put together on this. It's a terrific, if you haven't visited that, it's a really kind of amazing set of data and visualization of it. And from that, we were able to discern that the violent crime rate, I'm just going to read this here so I don't get these cities wrong, but went up in 5 years and down in 5 years over the last 10 years in Oakland, Phoenix, Wichita, New Orleans, and Louisville. So just as an example, that's certainly not an exhaustive list, but you do see some bouncing around in some cities where it's been up 2 years and then down and then up again and then down 2 years and this kind of fluctuation. So our takeaway from the context, the concentration and the fluctuation is very much along the lines of what Thomas said. These are situations that deserve a response, and they deserve a response that's backed by evidence about what actually works to reduce violence. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ames Grout from the Brennan Center. I want to thank first the Marshall Project and John Jay for having us. If y'all don't read the Marshall Project's opening statement every morning covering criminal justice news, I highly encourage it. It's basically a political playbook for this field. It's excellent. And also to thank both of the speakers who've come before me, like a good former appeals ADA. I'll incorporate those by reference. So just to tell you a little bit about what the Brennan Center does in this field and why I'm here. So for the past 3 years or so, we've looked at trends in the 30 largest cities and tried to build off of local police data to come up with an informed estimate about what crime rates will be in those cities by the end of the year. I think it's been a very useful service. It especially fills some of the gap between official data releases from the FBI, which we all know come 9 months after the fact, and a year between releases. So what we're trying to do with these is to give you sort of a first cut at what we think crime trends are going to look like. They've been fairly accurate as well. We just posted a blog on our website, which I encourage you to visit and read, that compares how our estimates have done against past increases. And we tend to get it within 1 to 3 percentage points back and forth. So why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because we are continuing that project. We're going to be looking at crime trends in 2017 as well. Our first cut did show a small decrease in the 30 largest cities, But if you factor in what I've just told you about, estimates can be high or low, that could mean that what we see in the 30 largest cities by the end of the year could be anywhere from a slight decrease to essentially holding stable to a slight increase, which I think a lot of scholars have talked about as well as a likely outcome. All that evidence, I think, tends to accord with what we've been saying before, that what we could be staring at is something we've seen in the past, a 2-year increase in homicides that may be poised to level off and decline. Another interesting point we've seen from our research is it's let us diagnose not just the broad trends, but sort of hotspots that are especially telling about these trends. So it helped us point out that what we were saying earlier about crime in Chicago, Chicago's not alone by any means. There are other cities where violence has gone up significantly and that are helping, if you would, drive the national conversation. One of them is Baltimore, which saw a decline in murder last year, but is back up again this year and hasn't really shed the sustained increase it saw in 2015. So none of what I'm saying about what we could be looking at is a 2-year increase that's poised to subside soon. None of that is meant to detract from real cause for concern about some of these cities and the many communities that still do struggle with violence. So a couple other things we've looked at and we plan to be tracking going forward is, it's easy to do, it's relatively easy to do estimates of crime trends in cities because you can get pretty regular data from city police departments at larger population centers. You can't do the same for rural areas. You can't do the same as well for suburban areas. And I think that's something to look at especially because we've seen sort of similar fluctuations in crime rates in rural areas. In 2015 they were up, in 2016 they were down. So it's something to consider what trends are going on there, what could be driving them as well. I think I'll leave my remarks there, and I'll look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, James. And so three really kind of my fellow panelists have given a very good overview of the main trends, I think. And so I'll just quickly talk about a little bit of the analysis that we've been doing at Vera. We produce a series of evidence briefs which are designed to be short, focused treatments of issues which are in the public eye and which are have a data element where people need to understand the research on a particular issue, and we kind of dove into this issue as part of that series. The most recent, so we produced a brief which was in response to the recent release of FBI figures that was already been mentioned a couple of weeks ago. And what we wanted to do as part of that was to say, let's look beyond the big cities where which tend to get more attention. And so we haven't, in the time available, haven't been able to go to a very granular level, but we're able to conduct analysis of places with populations of greater than 100,000. So that's like 294 cities. And the advantage of doing that is it allows you to start to disaggregate a little bit as well. So to look at the experiences of people who live or jurisdictions of different sizes. So I just want to throw up a couple of slides. This one this is the curve that everyone has been talking about, right? Showing that the fact that there was an increase during the 70s and 80s in violent crime on this slide up until the early 90s, and then we've seen decreases. And Adam was talking about the slight bump that we saw in the mid-90s, and you'll see that there on the slide. So what we found when we looked at, so firstly, the point that's been made, we're at a point now, even despite recent increases, we are less than half of the levels that we saw there in the early 90s. And we can see that there was an uptick in across all of the jurisdiction sizes in the last couple of years. You can see that when you look at smaller places, that those places do tend to be safer, and they experience the same kind of trends that we see for larger cities. So the blue line at the bottom is the smaller jurisdictions. And here, this is the same data for homicides. And again, you can see that we're about 43% of the peak across all of these all of these size jurisdictions. And actually, when you look at the smaller cities, 100 to 1,000 to 250,000, there was a slight downturn from 2015 to 2016. The challenge, these are all average rates, and of course the challenge looking at average data when it comes to crime trends is they disguise a huge amount of variation between places. And so the other issue that we wanted to look at in a bit more detail is how can you start to pull this apart to say, what does the experience look like if you look at individual jurisdictions? And so this table, which is from the recent report that we released, firstly shows that if you look at violent crime rates by jurisdiction, when we looked at these 294 jurisdictions, we found that the safest, the one with the lowest crime rate, they had 44 violent crimes per 100,000 population, compared to the upper bound, which was 2,047 violent crimes per 100,000. So within these jurisdictions, there was a factor of 46 difference between the safest and the most violent. These are outliers, but I think it just shows that if you just look at an average rate, you are disguising a huge amount of variation. And then if you look at this table here, it shows if you look at 2015 to 2016, a time when there has been an overall increase in violent crime, it's all over the board in terms of places that are going up and down. So this middle area here, is this a pointer? The area that's labeled as minimal change are places where year on year there was very little difference. That things changed. There was some difference in change of violent crime. There's fluctuations. There always is, but basically things stayed the same. And then at both ends of the scale, you saw cities where the violent crime rate was going down, and you saw cities where the violent crime rate was going up. And so, for example, for this year period, 2015 to 2016, 56% of places experienced minimal change. Basically, things kind of stayed the same. 12% the violent crime rate went down, and 31% of places it went up. So yes, there's been this average aggregate increase, but in 68% of places, either the crime rate stayed the same or it went down. So if you're thinking about making national policy, about making national policy decisions based on what's happening in terms of these crime rates, and you think that if you have the theory that being more punitive or reacting to increasing crime is going to improve the situation, then that would not apply in 2/3 of places. You'll be making a decision and trying to fix something that was not broken, or at least the trend suggests that things are not getting more dangerous in 2/3 of places. And I think this is just a really important point, which I think many or most people in this room get, but that looking at these average changes is potentially going to drive policy in the wrong way, when what we've seen over the last 2-3 decades is that our policy choices are having the effect of reducing crime, that what we're doing is largely working. Still, as Thomas said, lots of progress to be made. We haven't solved the problem, but we're doing a lot of things right, and there's a danger of undoing a lot of that progress if we don't look at the nuance of these data. And the same, I won't dwell on this too much, this is homicide rates, and again, you'll see the same kind of trends. Most places roughly say the same. 62% of places we looked at had fairly stable homicide rates. 16% experienced decreases, and 22% experienced increases. So some of these places that are experiencing increases, they are large cities, and that's really driving the national average. But still, if you do the math, so in this case, 78% of places had stable or decreasing homicide rates. So more than 3/4 of the jurisdictions that we looked at. And so, this really, I just think, adds a little bit of detail to what we've already heard, but drilling down to the jurisdictional level and thinking about what is happening outside of large cities, where a large proportion of the population lives, is important when we think about these kind of questions. Look forward to questions, to answering any questions.
What they said. I haven't heard, and I think we're all kind of sitting here thinking that nobody has said anything that anybody reasonably thoughtful about these issues would disagree with so far. I may break that trend, we'll see. So I want to make 3 points. So one is that, Adams said this, or rather Thomas has said this already, and I want to say it again in a slightly more emphatic way, that the national conversation about this has focused on this issue of movement and trend or no trend, We should not think that that's the issue. The issue is the steady state and the baseline. Because in the midst of this long national crime decline, which is real, one of the things that we're really good at in criminal justice is counting bodies, and so these are real numbers. They are to be relied upon, and they show both this long national decline, which is to be celebrated, and what we also all know is that in all big cities, and in lots and lots and lots of other cities, there are particular communities that have, while they've come down usually from the worst years of the 1990s, people are living in unconscionable conditions of persistent violence, trauma, and fear. And we as a nation, have taken that as normal, and so when things change, we focus on the change. The scandal is what's normal, and in this moment where we're debating these small changes, and the national homicide rate had come down to between 4 and 5 per 100,000 and is now edging back up toward 5. There are places in communities there are communities and cities all over the country where especially young men of color are experiencing persistent homicide rates of over 500 per 100,000 year after year after year after year. That's the story. And everything we know about the increases are that they are in those same places, those same communities, those same people. This is not reaching out into different demographics. It's not reaching out into different communities. It's not reaching out into places that have not experienced this problem. It is a worsening among the people in places that have been enduring this forever. So it's an important question about what's driving the changes, but we should not make the mistake of thinking that that is the issue. That is not the issue. The issue is we have been living with this forever and we have not acted effectively around it. And that thing we have been living with forever is getting somewhat worse in some places. The second thing that I would say is that we are flying blind on this, which is unconscionable. So you've just heard a more granular and refined analysis about what's going on than you can get from the federal government of the United States. The best work on this has been done by journalists. So the Marshall Project itself and its sister and brethren has done really good analytic work on this. The Brennan Center as an entity has done better analysis and reporting on this than any other single academic or quasi-academic institution. We have, because of the work you've done, the intuition that maybe this calendar year will look a little bit better than we've been afraid of, which just means that we're going to be, at best, we're going to be back to these unconscionable conditions that we've been living with all these years. And I don't know, Jim, what was behind the analysis that you just presented, but my guess is you did that in your spare time, right?
Not me personally, my colleagues have been.
And that's better than the Justice Department. That's unconscionable. We're 18 months behind the reality on the ground, and all we're getting from the reporting by the national data sources on this, which is overwhelmingly the FBI and the UCR, is it's up a little bit or down a little bit in these political jurisdictions. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what's behind it. We have no understanding of the range of what's driving the incidents, whether that mix is different in different places. It's ridiculous. And we know that a lot of what we're getting is wrong. I mean, we know it's wrong. So out of work that many of you are familiar with, we know for a fact now the important reality that this kind of homicide is driven overwhelmingly by groups and networks of high-rate offenders. We know that now. The FBI will tell you that there are something under 1,000 gang killings in the United States a year, when it's probably closer to half or better than that, because on the supplemental homicide report, there's a forced choice, and one box you can tick is gangland slaying, which goes back to Al Capone. They haven't updated it since then. So when there were a couple of Ebola patients who might have been coming into the country, there was an entire apparatus of public health monitoring and surveillance and clinical intervention and epidemiology and emergency planning and the mobilization of treatment and isolation protocols and stockpiling of pharmaceuticals. And of course, all of that was linked to a continuous program of deep research in virology. The country hasn't done anything on this. And if you do this work, or if you cover this work, you know that the cities affected are entirely on their own. They have gotten essentially no help from the states that they're in. There is no thoughtful or measured or even framed national strategy about dealing with this. The way we're dealing with this is debating on the basis of poor information whether it's a trend or not. We're not doing anything. And the third point I'd make is that there are things that work around these urban homicide issues. Some of the people here will be part of a panel tomorrow that will be talking about this. There are things that work, and there's nothing about those things that work that suggest that they would work last year, but they won't work today because things are 15% worse in that city than they are last year. We are not paying any meaningful attention to the small but important portfolio of interventions that we know are effective around these issues. And just to say it again, the cities are floundering, the states are missing in action, and the federal government is effectively missing in action. And we operationally can do a better job of this. Morally and socially and politically, we should consider an obligation to do a better job than this, and instead we get these panels.
All right, thank you. That's an excellent start for the
No
conversation.
disrespect to the panel, by the way.
Before we sort of go any further, this initially had been sort of a discussion about analyzing this year's UCR numbers for the media. And I want to get a sense of how many of you are reporters or journalists or write about crime data in some capacity. A few of you, okay. Excellent. So we can keep that in mind. Thankfully, you answered most of the questions I had already prepared. So I'll ask one for each of you, and then maybe give a chance for the audience. I think we've got about 15 or 20 minutes left for the conversation. I guess my question is, and you've touched on this a little bit implicitly, but what are some of the most common mistakes you see either in journalist or academic writing when people write about crime data and about the UCR? What are the things that you persistently notice that are omitted or sort of crimes in writing about crime? And I'll open this to any of you. Adam.
I'm happy to go first, just to plead guilty. Having been a crime reporter for 5 years myself, I wrote lots of bad stories, and most of them were bad because I tried to explain whether crime was going up or down, and how bad it was and what was going on simply by calling the chief of police and allowing the chief to have the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. It was literally, and I think that's still what goes on today, 25 years later. The chief is an important, obviously, player and voice, and has an important perspective, but there are so many other players and voices and systems that have to be brought into the conversation if you're going to have effective anti-violence strategies, whether they're on the health side or all kinds of other agencies, certainly community supervision, people responsible for corrections and probation and parole, and supervising those people who are at high risk for both committing and for victimization. they never get a phone call. They're never drawn into a conversation that, I shouldn't say never, right? Very rarely brought into a conversation that actually acknowledges the critical role that they play in overall strategies to reduce violence.
Thanks. And so I think there's just a quick story, illustrative example about a story that got picked up by the New York Times in 2015 when there was an early release of mid-year crime data, which was kind of at the beginning of this conversation about are we seeing a crime trend. And basically what the Times did was they identified 10 cities where there had been large increases in crime during that first 6 months of 2015, and then use this as evidence that this was an early warning of a crime wave, and used fairly strong language in the way they reported this. So these were 10 large cities, including Milwaukee, St. Louis, Baltimore, Chicago, Dallas, other places. They were only 10 of the 60 biggest cities that fell into that. So the population range that they represented, they could have chosen any of 60 cities, but they decided to represent these 10. And I think what this shows is that there's a danger of overgeneralization from small numbers of places that are selected because they do represent some kind of change. And so one overgeneralization, and two, taking short-run numbers and statistics as the beginning of a trend when really it was too early to tell. And what we saw in those 10 places, kind of fast forward a year, many of them after a period of increase, then the crime rate went down. It was a fluctuation. Some of them did go on to experience sustained increases, but this generated a series of stories and got picked up by policymakers and politicians as evidence of this burgeoning crime wave. And of course, like journalists have this responsibility, and it's easy, I think, to misinterpret data in ways that can exaggerate what we're actually seeing. The story is different now. There has been more sustained change, but still, I think this is just an example of how it's very easy to misinterpret data. Also, the other change, when you're looking at percentage change, it's really easy to exaggerate change, because if you have someone with a very low base rate, I did a talk before at John Jay on this topic, and as an example, I looked at another rare phenomenon, and I found out that that there had been a 300% increase in deaths by bee stings in the UK over a 1 year period. And the only reason, of course, was 1 year there was one death by a bee sting, and the next year there were 3 deaths. But if you look at the headline, it's like, my God, there's like a swarm of killer bees descending over the UK. And so sorry to be flippant, but it's, it's very easy to misinterpret percentage changes when you're looking at these often fairly rare phenomena. If you're in a small jurisdiction where there has not been much violence, a big percentage change can look fairly alarming when actually it may just be a normal fluctuation.
So, in terms of, candidly, I want to do something right now that I almost never do, which is I want to pick a fight. I respect greatly and value the colleagueship of Pew, Vera, the Brennan Center, but and this has been a very respectful conversation. But I do essentially hear 3 statements downplaying a massive increase in homicide, and I think that that's a problem. You can slice and dice this data in many different ways. You can say, look at the less populous cities, when in fact more people live in the biggest cities. If you look at all of the cities for 100,000 people and up, more than half of those cities have experienced an increase in violent crime last year. 59% of them experienced an increase over the 2 years. If you look at just the top 100 largest cities, because this crime spike is more pronounced in the larger cities, it's significantly more than half. And and I have to say that if progressives won't address violent crime squarely, if they will only change the subject, if they will only minimize, if they will only say it's complicated, well, then you know who speaks to violent crime? It will be law and order types like Trump and Sessions. That's a real problem, and we owe it to the people that we fight for as progressives. I consider myself a committed progressive. We owe it to those people not to generate a affirmative policy response aimed directly at homicide and violent crime. And that needs to be elevated to the top of our agenda. The other thing is, I just want to emphasize this. The irony is, we have a great story to tell. The leaders in this field are progressives. And the other things that we do, the other reforms that we are pushing as progressives are consistent with crime reduction. We don't have to change the subject on this issue, and we don't have to minimize, we don't have to say it's complicated, although it certainly is complicated. But Jesus, 22% over 2 years? 3,000 more homicides per year in 2016 than 2014? I don't think it's that complicated.
Can I just quickly respond? Absolutely. So I think that I would never say that that what we're seeing in the data is not a problem. I would never say that it's not something we need to do something about. I think that the problem is that it can easily be characterized in ways that the response is a broad brush response which is applied nationally using the same approach. And when we say it's complicated, the fact is that it's playing out differently from place to place, and the response needs to be different. And as David mentioned, where we are seeing big crime spikes in inner city areas, we know there are things that we should be doing and that we shouldn't minimize those responses, but we need to guard against a knee-jerk reaction that is based on misinterpretation of data because there aren't organizations that are providing a counterbalance to this potential interpretation that we're in the middle of a crime wave and the American carnage and everything else that we've heard.
Yeah, I can speak to what I think are some of the origins of this debate. I don't disagree with anything that Thomas said, and I don't think most of us do. I don't think anyone here wants to minimize any problem that exists with violent crime. I think we all agree that there are some solutions needed. I think the problem is this all started, I think, about a year ago when we saw now the President of the United States say at the Republican National Convention, the quote is something like a decade of progress worth of controlling violent crime is being reversed by the Obama administration. Any way you cut it with that data, it's just not true. To have violent crime go from where it is today to where it was in 1991, homicides in New York would have to increase by a rate of more than 300%, and that's simply not going to happen. So I think when you hear lies like that, when you hear just blatant misstatements, it galvanizes so many of us. I know it galvanized me and my colleagues to, be the countervailing voice in the room and say that's not true. The problem is, in that sort of contrarian space, it can suck the oxygen out of the room for the middle point, which is there's no crime wave, decades of progress aren't being reversed, but there are some spots where we need affirmative answers. Let's figure out those answers. That's where I think the origin of the debate is, and I think where we all agree, but I'm not going to speak for y'all.
I'll just say, I think that that's a good point. And I have to say, I don't really know the answer as a matter of politics. I was speaking with a colleague who works in the media who's here now. And, if one side is shouting, as a matter of political strategy, do you shout back? Or do you, I don't presume to know. But I do know that the way we're talking about these issues ensures, I worry, that the proper attention to this persistent social phenomenon, whether or not it's increasing or decreasing, that causes enormous suffering. Remember that homicide for young men is the third leading cause of death. For Latino young men, it's the second leading cause of death. For African American young men, it's the first leading cause of death, and it causes more deaths than the entire other top 9 causes of death. That is striking. If that doesn't mobilize you, note that for every homicide, the conservative estimates are that every homicide costs us collectively, lest we think that this is just somebody else's problem, about $7 million. That's the low estimate. The high estimate is about 17, and I'm only giving you the credible estimates, the ones that are in peer-reviewed journals. So we have to elevate this issue in a way, but in a way that avoids this fear-mongering, because I do think we need to have countervailing messages when people say, oh, this is American carnage. It isn't. This is a nationwide crime wave. It isn't. It's not. It's also not about immigration. It's also, as far as we can tell, not about opioids or drugs. We need to get under the hood as to what this is, and as David said, use some of the strategies that have already been demonstrated to work.
So we have just a few minutes left, but I wanted to give people a chance if there are questions that any of you in the audience have or want to bring to the panel. Here, let me bring you the microphone.
Good afternoon. Frank Pizzella. I'm on faculty here at John Jay. This morning I was writing a question for a class for an exam I'm going to give tomorrow, and it's about the limitations of the Uniform Crime Report as a reflection of the true crime rate. And hearing you all speak today, I'm just wondering to what extent the Uniform Crime Report, as that reflection of the true crime rate, compares with something like the National Crime Victimization Survey, recognizing that it doesn't include murder rates, but one of the things we talk about is a much more representative sample. So I think that when you can get the UCR rates analysis and NCVS analysis to compare and triangulate, then you have a much better picture, of the crime rate. So could you just address how that comparison matches up?
So I think that's an excellent point. I mean, there's two, when you look at the FBI crime reports, there's two stages, right? It requires that someone reports a crime to the police for the UCR data we're looking at. And then it requires that police jurisdiction makes a report to the FBI. And so that's also another shortfall, is that there is a fairly high non-response rate to the UCR data. And so they use estimation techniques as well. So any estimate of crime, of course, is imperfect. And the less serious the crime, the more likely there is to be a gap. I mean, I think that one of the reasons, and I think that David mentioned this, that the homicide data is compelling and important, is because obviously homicide is an incredibly important thing to measure, but also because it's one of the things that is generally well reported. There's a body. Usually there's a report made when there's a homicide. So there is this gap. I think that tracking homicide data is a more reliable measure than other types of crime. But I mean, if we look at property crime, you look at data over time, yes, it's an perfect measure, but yes, we also see property crime going down. So also, I think there are very different trends in these different types of crime.
Then beyond that, there's almost entirely a analytic void behind those numbers. So we have a lot of confidence in the body count and in the reporting of the body count. That's all we know, right? So there was a public health report just recently saying that, sort of akin to what we're talking about here, there's been an historic reversal in life expectancy in the United States. And the people who authored that report were able to say, and we can trace that to diseases associated with the opioid epidemic and alcoholism. It is being felt among these particular demographics in particular places. There's a story that they can tell out of the medical reporting that we cannot tell about crime, because it's as if there were no medical information except there was a death. Not who, not where, well, we forgot where, but not what demographic, not what context, not what cause. We know almost nothing beyond the raw numbers.
All right. On that note, we should probably sadly wrap this up, although I feel like I could talk for another hour about all these issues. I want to thank all of our panelists so much for your insights today. Thank you, everybody, for attending the discussion.